This is the first panel of the Digital Youth Future Track. So that's a kickoff. And as I'm sure you know, this is one of these topics where the devil lies in the details, maybe much more than in any other topic, actually. And therefore, it's more than ever very important to mix different perspectives and making sure everyone is heard. I know it is still breakfast time, but we have a wonderful menu to start the day. We've got on the menu the Trailblazing Data Protection Authority that everyone should be looking at and reading. Carly, can you hear me?
I can, Sophie. I hope you can hear me. And hello,
okay,
everyone.
that's wonderful. Oh, and we can also even see you.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much for having accepted the invitation. No pressure, but everyone is watching Australia.
And I'm happy to hear that I'm on the menu. I'm not so sure I'm happy to hear I'm on the menu. So that doesn't mean I'm going to get eaten, but very happy to join you and wish I could be there in person, of course.
And I mean, it's also very clear that you've taken your job description very seriously. So I'm sure you've plenty to tell us. We've got also Ben Brake, who is a Director General of Dot Europe. Dot Europe is an organization that brings together platform companies of all sizes from all relevant countries active in Europe. I think the organization has 22 members. 21, okay. Some of them being the biggest players. Exactly. And if I'm not mistaken, one core mission is to support an open and safe internet.
Absolutely.
Camille Biot is project officer at Forum des Jeunes since 2022. The Forum des Jeunes is the National Youth Council of Belgium for French-speaking youth aged between 16 and 30. Yes. And Karen de Rijmaker. Karen, she's a PhD candidate in developmental psychology at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Science at the VUB. Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, your research focuses on the impact of digital technology in the development of children.
Yeah, it focuses on instant messaging. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. So let's see whether this morning the voices are in harmony. And let's start with Carly. Carly, the Australian government moved quite quickly to implement an age-based ban on social media for under 16. And as I said, now everyone therefore is looking at Australia, but not everyone seems to be interpreting recent achievements exactly in the same way. What can you tell us? What has been achieved so far?
Thanks, Sophie, and very happy to share the experience here in Australia. And I do so with kind of a number of hats on, I suppose. One is as a privacy advocate and an activist for many years, and somebody who, before the social media ban came into effect in Australia, spoke out against the idea of age gating and age assurance online and expressed my doubt about whether it should be rolled out in Australia because of privacy concerns. But my other hat is as regulator of the social media scheme that we have now in effect. And I have to say the experience of regulating the obligation has been very interesting and has really brought to the fore some of the tensions that exist in this space between, on the one hand, creating a place that's safe and private for children, and on the other hand, protecting privacy of children, but also of all the other internet users that are out there that are having to have their age assured under this scheme. I understand, Sophie, by some of your references that there is already some familiarity in the room with what has happened in Australia, but just to very quickly recap that. So it has been about 6 months now since the obligation on social media platforms to prevent children under the age of 16 from accessing those platforms came into effect. And the obligation is one to take reasonable steps to ensure that children under the age of 16 don't access social media platforms. And so this notion of taking reasonable steps is the legal obligation, and then kind of what flows from that is the subject of both guidance from the E-Safety Commissioner, which regulates the obligation to exclude children, and from my office, which regulates the privacy protections that are inherent there in the legislation. And again, as I said, there's a kind of a tension there, which is how far is too far in terms of complying with the obligation to take reasonable steps, and when do reasonable steps verge into disproportionate efforts to verify or assure age. In terms of what's happened in that 6 months, I think there has been mixed reporting and there's mixed data in terms of how effective the compliance has been with the obligation to exclude children from social media platforms. We are really in the early days of the scheme. 6 months is not a long time for us to really see and to be able to interrogate the extent of compliance with the obligation. Of course, we're talking about the major platforms, and that in and of itself creates a compliance and enforcement challenge for small regulators. But moreover, the technical implementation of the obligation, it has been an evolving one. So whereas during the legislative process, it was anticipated that platforms would use age verification using identity documents to comply with the obligation to exclude children. In actual fact, they are not using age verification using government ID documents, but they are using a range of other methods, including age estimation. So the use of third-party platforms that estimate age on the basis of facial features, biometric features, and others. And they are using age inference, so inferring from data that they already hold the age of users. So it's not been the case that when the obligation came into effect in Australia in December last year, that every internet user had to verify their age online, or even that children had to verify their age using any form of identification. For most people, myself included, as a holder of an Instagram account and others, I had no visibility that my age was being assured in any way, because they were using these other methods, including age inference, or perhaps how long I'd held the account, for more than 10 years, etc. They were inferring that I was over the age of 16. So that's just to give you a flavor of like some of the uncertainties or evolving issues in terms of interpretation and implementation that are happening in terms of compliance with the scheme. There has been some reporting from the platforms that they have closed over 4 million accounts pertaining to children. But then there is other reporting that shows only a small percentage of children are actually being excluded from the platforms, and that many are in fact still using social media platforms. And I think it's fair to say that the truth is a mixture of those things. We don't see full coverage yet. We don't see that the ban is fully implemented. The E-Safety Commissioner hasn't yet launched compliance or enforcement action around that, because there's been giving them some breathing space to implement the obligation. And in terms of effectiveness and how it's playing out, and I'm sure we'll get to this, the effects on children, that is being measured over a longer time period. So I think it's too early essentially to say, A, is it effective in the sense that are children actually being blocked for these platforms? But B, is it achieving the policy intent in terms of how it's changing children's experience online? And then C, and I'll wrap up here, in terms of the protection of privacy of Australians, it's still a little early to understand also to what extent the platforms are going too far, or to what extent this new obligation is resulting in unjustifiable privacy interferences with Australians. We're still in the early days of understanding how much data is being used, how it's being handled, is it being appropriately deleted as soon as the age assurance use or purpose is executed. Those kinds of things, again, we're just still really trying to understand. So early days yet, and yeah, happy to keep sharing more information as the panel goes on.
Okay, and I think it's very useful that you mentioned that we've got so far mixed data. Can you tell us a little bit about how the ban is actually being monitored, the effect of the ban is being monitored? as you go, even if we don't have any proper enforcement just yet?
Yeah, so we're fortunate in Australia to have two regulators in this space. So I'm the data protection regulator, but the compliance with the ban is actually regulated by the e-safety commissioner, and they have some early concerns around compliance, but in terms of monitoring the effects on children, they've established a study with Stanford University where they're monitoring a cohort of children. I think it's in the hundreds of children that are in Australia subject to the ban, and they're monitoring the impact of the ban on a whole range of different facets of those children's lives, including kind of mental health, sleep, relationship with families, etc. I think that will give us a picture of the impact. I think more broadly, there's some, I think there will need to be some longitudinal assessment of how the ban is changing culturally and societally, how it is affecting Australia. I would say anecdotally, although many children anecdotally tell me they're still using some social media platforms, it's clear that social media use by children is becoming culturally less accepted. And that parents welcome that, and that parents are very pleased to have a reason to tell their children that they can't use social media or can't get onto social media at that age where we commonly see children wanting to use social media, so like 11, 12, 13 years old. It's clear that parents are very happy now to have like a lever to pull to say it's illegal. You can't have a social media account. And so I think that's going to change kind of at the cultural and societal level. That's going to change things over time. And I only have that anecdotal evidence at the moment, but I suspect we'll see things changing. Certainly, the ban has widespread support in Australian society, or at least prior to it coming into effect. It did something like 75% of people supported it. So I think that will kind of probably increase with time as well.
Okay, so it does show that many needed to have some form of psychological support, maybe, to be able to raise the children in some ways in a more aligned way with what they were thinking. If I'd like to bring you back to age assurance, because you've been looking at the details, which is quite rare actually, and you've been iterating as well in terms of guidance, trying to define what looks good and what looks bad or not exactly very good. What can you tell us on that? You mentioned earlier the distinction between age inference and age estimation. I have a very technical question here because in Europe we are also struggling with the definition of biometric data that might be used also for age verification. But before I do that, why did you felt that it was actually necessary to go back twice on that question and actually issue a wider and a broader guidance on age assurance?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to get into the weeds. I'm sure it's a very technical audience there who also enjoys being in the weeds. So we issued two sets of guidance. The first was just in relation to the implementation of the social media ban. And that had a specific set of obligations because the social media ban legislation has additional privacy protections that don't otherwise exist in data protection law. And those are essentially that you have to delete any information that you acquire for the purposes of age assurance immediately, unless you have the consent of the person to retain it for longer. And also that you have to provide a method that is not the provision of government identity documents when you're assuring age. So you have to provide alternatives to providing a government ID. And those are specific privacy protections that are contained in the social media legislation that are additional to the privacy obligations in the data protection legislation here. And so we first issued that guidance that was about age assurance in the context of the social media ban. And then we saw that age assurance is now becoming adopted more widely, both by platforms that aren't specifically within the remit of the social media ban, but voluntarily complied with it. So platforms like Discord, for example, but and Blue Sky, but also because under another piece of Australian law, a code that was issued by the eSafety Commissioner, age assurance is now required at the search engine level in order to prevent access to harmful material. So that when that obligation came into effect in March, we issued more broad age assurance guidelines that really just set out the obligations of data protection law writ large when it comes to age assurance. As you said, so some of that gets quite technical in the sense that it engages with the actual technical mechanisms for implementing age assurance. It looks at what it means to take a data minimization approach when it comes to age assurance. So really about keeping only age tokens rather than all information acquired for purposes of age assurance. And it also, I think, underscores the point that we come back to, which is the steps taken to assure age must be proportionate to the harm and the risk that you're trying to prevent, and the stakes around that. So in the context in which there's not a legal obligation to exclude children and there's not a likelihood of harmful material, for example, we continue to think that age declaration, so just saying I'm over 16, I'm over 18, is sufficient. We, as a data protection authority, are not saying that you need to verify age through one of these technical mechanisms in every circumstance. You should make a choice on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not you need to assure age, and then how far you need to go to assure age, and whether or not age declaration is sufficient in the circumstances.
Okay, and so more technically, if we go to that distinction between age inference and age estimation, can you tell us a little bit about your definition of biometric data, and when do you think that's starting to be sensitive?
So in Australian law, the definition of sensitive captures biometric data that's obtained for identification, and we interpret that as including for age estimation. So we include it as a sensitive piece of information. And the Australian law also specifically references biometric templates as well as a separate form of sensitive information. So we have I suppose have taken an inclusive approach to the definition of sensitive information in that regard. I would say that I think this is this is a potential next area of battleground in terms of what is sensitive information across a range of different fronts. We've been doing a lot of facial recognition cases here, for example, and we see some contest being raised as to whether or not images for the purposes of facial recognition in retail settings, for example, amount to sensitive information. That hasn't been tested in the courts yet, so it's our position that it does until a court decides otherwise.
Okay, thank you so much. And I've got one last question before I go to Ben. If we zoom out and look at the broader regulatory architecture, is there anything missing? Are there gaps between what the law currently allows or mandates and what would actually make a difference for young people as safety online?
Yeah, absolutely. In Australia, our privacy legislation makes no reference to children at all, so it doesn't distinguish between protections provided to the community at large and then children or other vulnerable groups. So we think there is clearly a need for more protections around children's online privacy. That is not about excluding them from online places, but rather making them safe when they are online. And remembering, of course, that the social media ban only captures social media platforms. That is the term used in the legislation, and that the actual entities, actual companies captured by that law are less than 20 currently. And of course, children's personal information is in vastly many more places than that, including many, many more online services, ed tech providers, games, streaming platforms, etc. So we're currently developing a children's online privacy code, having been given a mandate to do that by Parliament in 2024. It will be modelled on the UK's age-appropriate design code, but we hope we'll be able to learn from the lessons of that code to go even further in terms of proposing protections for children online. One of the novel things that we think that our draft code includes is we're proposing a two-step consent process, whereby if a child is under the age in which they can consent to the collection of their personal information and their parents are required to consent on their behalf, a child still needs to assent to the collection of that personal information so that they are still involved in the process of acquiring their information and that it's not just outsourced to their parents. We also have some proposed protections in there about notifying children when their parents have turned on parental controls or other forms of geolocation tracking on tools and services that children are using. And it also embeds best interests of the child as the overarching framework for the code. So that code is currently in consultation at the moment, and it will become law at the end of this year.
Okay, thank you so much, Carly, for that deep dive into Australian law. I'm moving then to Ben, and I'm going to ask Ben to look at what Australia has been doing. From Dot's perspective, are there any lessons learned for the European debate already?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. And thank you very much for actually explaining the Australian situation. I learn a lot on these kinds of panels. For example, that you mentioned that there is no distinctions between group in your privacy law in Australia, so namely not of children. That is already a difference here in the European Union because we have a very sophisticated, some would say complicated system of laws in place on the EU level and on the national level to protect children, especially online. When you look, for example, only to name a few, the AVMSD directive, the GDPR, but also the DSA, for example. That is only what is happening on the EU level. When you look at the implementation and the responsibility of the member states, there's a very sophisticated system of dossiers and laws in place that protect children online. So the question would be, if we look at this from a broader perspective, if we approach this in an evidence-based way, is there, how to say, an added value to our rules and rules in place if we would go for a strict general social media ban here in the EU? And from our perspective, there is, if we look at it from an evidence-based angle, there's not that much evidence that a general ban on social media platforms could actually do any good to the children. From our point of view, the discussion has to start from looking at different types and forms of social media platforms. And for that, we have a law in place, the DSA, that allows for a certain flexibility, that allows for a conversation with the platform companies actually to come to terms with the proper solutions to protect children online, because solutions in place yesterday might not be the right solutions in the future. Just yesterday we had a conversation, you remember, about agentic AI, or so what will this mean when that comes actually, when this will be implemented on social media platforms? And therefore we need, I think, a bit more flexibility, and the DSA is the right place actually to have this discussion with the platforms.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'd like to make you stay on DSA and EU law more specifically. You mentioned that, at least in your view, we've got a slightly more complicated way of dealing with children. You mentioned GDPR, DSA. There is clearly a focus on the risk assessment. But at the same time on safety by design as well as privacy by design or data protection by design. How do you members experience those two, this regulatory philosophy in practice? And when you compare with what's happening in Australia, do you think that leads to different outcomes for users?
Most certainly that leads to different outcomes because all the platforms are different. I mean, if you take, for example, not a member of ours, but if you take X, for example, that's different to YouTube. That's then again different to Meta slash Facebook. So the outcomes differs, of course, when you look at the different platforms that are there on the market.
And now, if I ask you to be a little bit more specific. And try to draw a distinction between what is working, has worked, and what has had really not so much a great effect or clearly a little real world effect. How would you distinguish between measures that are intended to protect children?
I think age assurance, age verification is one tool, and I think on certain platforms that should probably be applied. You have, for example, porn platforms, not members of ours, but I think there, for example, we can all agree that a very strict age verification should be in place. But other platforms, I think, especially those that are used, especially by those who grow up in a cohort that is where maturity is not defined by a certain age, because when you, for example, compare girls and boys of the same age, like 14 or so, most of the time girls are more advanced, for example, in maturity than boys. When you compare different socioeconomic groups, for example, one with, good education, one with lesser education, for example, there the results also vary. So I think the perspective should be more on the groups actually to put safeguards in place from different platforms than this kind of a general rule approaching the platforms with saying that there is a certain threshold only above which you can actually access, because that would exclude also young people from participating in society, in culture, in politics. I know this from time to time is an argument where many say that, yeah, okay, right. But the problem is I think we have a broader problem currently in society. Many of especially the young people feel left behind, not only because of we are now talking again, I'm happy that we're actually talking with young people here on the panel, but we're talking about something that actually political decision makers will vote on, and that will only affect them without them having any say at the table. And on the other hand, we look at it also from a broader perspective. The young people, they are currently very challenged. You have the pandemic. They were particularly isolated. You have the climate change. They will probably not get anything out of social security systems. So I think it is now time actually to also incorporate them more into decision making. And that is currently something what I can see on certain levels, especially like in Germany, where the commission that is put in place by the Ministry for Youth, that also incorporates the views of younger people. And I think the expert panel at the commission, on the commission side, also incorporates the view of younger people. And I think that is a good way forward.
Okay, thank you. One last point. So you mentioned AI earlier. How does AI and generative AI, agentic AI, is really changing the picture?
I think this I'm very sorry to only be answered to these questions with "it depends," but unfortunately also this depends. Of course, we are talking. Yesterday we talked about about the risks of agentic AI or generative AI in general. But look at it from a positive angle. This could also help actually with moderating content on platforms. This could also help with assessing whether or not content is suitable for a certain group or for certain young people or not. So I think this is the perspective Dot is taking, that agentic AI, probably more generative AI, could actually help with moderating the content on the specific platforms.
Okay, which potentially would mean therefore that there will be more monitoring of user behavior potentially? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily per se say that this is a bad thing to monitor, especially content that is actually provided to certain users. In a way, currently that is done by algorithms that, based on preference of the users, you will get you will see certain content. But if AI could help actually to put an additional layer of security on this, I would actually not jump to early conclusions to condemn this, actually.
Okay. Okay, as long as we manage to actually secure these very nice agents, which is not a given, I'm being told.
That is absolutely right.
Camille, I wanted to start with a very broad question. How does the Forum des Jeunes view youth digital future, with hope, concerns, worries, anxiety, and why?
Thanks for the invitation. As Ben said, it's really nice to have youth involved in the conversation. I work at the National Youth Council, so we are no expert, no specialists in AI, social media, technology. We just collect the voices of the youth here in Belgium, and then we try to get them heard at the policy level. So yes, that's our main objective. And then to go back to your question, I think it's a bit of hope and a bit of concern, because obviously digital tools create great opportunities for young people, but not just young people, also for citizens in general, if they are correctly regulated by platforms, and if citizens are given the right education to use these tools. However, we see that there are many discussions at the policy level happening around the globe, also in Belgium, where the main focus is restriction as a means of protection. But I think we need to be reminded of different things. The first one is that young people will go on social media, whether we like it or not. They will go around these restrictions, they will find ways, and they will access social media. The second one is that platforms need to be held accountable, and the responsibility should not only fall on the young people themselves and or their parents. And the third one is that education still remains one of the best keys to making sure that people, so again, not just young people, but citizens in general, know how to use social media and different platforms in a safe way. Because if we just delay the access to social media, then you're just going to have, well, adults accessing social media, but not knowing how to in a safe way.
Okay, so in your view, building on what you've just said, which approaches then come closest to what young people actually need then?
Mm-hmm. It's a difficult question. It's difficult to pinpoint one solution that would be closest to what young people need, because there is diversity in the youth, and so there is not only one option, like the best solution, but rather many different options that are possible. As I've said, media education is still one of the most important thing. Because social media can be beneficial, but again, you need to be given the right tools to navigate them. I think also, again, we interview young people quite frequently here in Belgium. And when we talk with them about social media, they realize that they do spend a lot of their free time on social media. So they know that it is addictive, but they also remind us that part of the responsibility should lie with the platforms to prevent this addiction. So not only with the users, but also and mostly with the provider. And we've talked about generative AI. They also say that it can create great opportunities and that it can be an immense useful tool. But they also say that they come across AI-generated content online quite often, and that it is not always easy to identify this content. It's becoming more and more difficult, actually. And so they would like also platforms to be more responsible on this and be more transparent and clearly state when it has been created and or modified partially or fully, through AI.
Mm-hmm. Which it might get through the AI Act, maybe. I know that you are not a legal expert, but from what you've heard and seen, is there a model that maybe stands out as being more effective?
Again, not really. As Carly Kine said, it might be too soon. Like, we are still in the early days of models coming out and testing things out. So even for us, it's difficult to say that one model stands out as more effective than the other. However, what we've come to see is that in terms of identification, is that if the responsibility lies with the platforms, it becomes less effective and can be also problematic in regards with data protection. So, for example, using personal data for commercial use. So for us, when we come back to the Belgium case, we see that the government is leaning also towards more of a age-based restriction solution. So obviously it's important to protect youth online, but shutting them out completely for us is not answering the main problems, which are the lack of media education, again, for citizens in general, not for young people, and also the need for a better regulation from platforms.
Okay. And now zooming out and looking at the debate, from where you stand, do you feel like that young people tend to be excluded from the conversation?
I can only speak for Belgium. Again, I'm sorry about that, National Youth Council and all. But as for most policy-making processes, young people are being not, well, excluded or tend to be included, but when it's already too late. So the decisions have already been made, and whatever like input they may give, it's not going to change the final outcome, which is shame. However, recently, well, back in January, the Forum des Jeunes, so as the National Youth Council, we were auditioned by the Federal Parliament on the issue of age-based restriction, which was already a good step. Like it was a step in the right direction, but it's obviously not enough. I think if we want policies to be fully endorsed by young people, they need to be included in the decision-making process from the very beginning and not at the end when everything is already decided. And that needs to include, well, qualitative and quantitative consultation with the young people. I know it takes time. But obviously it's part of the participation process, and it's not only about young people, it's about citizens in general. If you want young people to actually understand the measures that you're taking and that will impact them and their future, it's very important that they are being part of the discussion, which is not the case right now.
Okay, Ben, you wanted to write very quickly.
Yeah, just it's quite a long time ago that I was young, but the thing with these kind of like integrating and taking into consideration the views of the young people, we are making again a mistake. We're generalizing it because there are no like young people. Because very often, I'm not familiar with the Belgium situation, but very often these kind of commissions or committees where young people are present, also those are handpicked people. Most of the time, people who are already like engaged in politics. But this is not how to say the average young. So what I would rather like to see, and that was back in the days when I was young, there was actually on the municipality level, you had this kind of like youth or youth councils that actually went through like normal elections as well. So where people were able to be like being elected. And I think that would probably show us the view of the young people and not so much these, don't get me wrong, please, not so much on these very often handpicked commissions and advisory committees.
Okay. Do you think a system of election would change representation?
I think so, yeah, of course. It would make it better.
I think also what I haven't said is that it's not the case with every national youth councils. With our national youth councils, we work with youth organizations, but like trying to reach for the diversity in the youth. So that's also very important. We have we are established by a decree here in Belgium that give us like very strict parameters to say that we are being representative. So that's why we aim to do, but obviously I do agree with the need to have a focus on representativity and not just like young people who are already engaged in politics and may have already an agenda. It's important to go for a broad representation of the young people.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's giving me a very good transition to Karen then. Let's try to dig further into this problem and start from the evidence that we might have on use of screens, access to apps, some subcategories of apps, such as social media, and the relation with mental health. What does the evidence say?
Okay, before I say something about our current knowledge, I want to say something about screen time, because I think it's important to realize that screen time is a really broad term. So people can look at their smartphones, at their tablets, at their TV screens, at their computer screens. So it does not capture the purpose of the screen time. So it could, for example, be entertainment, fulfilling social needs, emotion regulation, and so forth. So it's really a container term. And it focuses mainly on the duration of the digital activities. And we know that the duration of these digital activities is not a good predictor for mental health. So today, researchers try to move away from those screen time measures. Instead, we focus more on the content and the types of digital activities. So the story is definitely much more complex than screen time alone. And regarding the current knowledge we have, the findings remain quite ambivalent. So sometimes studies find positive associations, meaning that social media, for example, are related to improve mental health, while other studies find the opposite associations, and other studies even don't find a significant association. So it's really a diverse picture we see, but we can see certain tendencies. So for example, passively and endlessly scrolling on your smartphone is generally related to poor mental health, while as engaging directly with others through, for example, messaging or posting content online is related generally to improved mental health. But even then, we should be cautious about overgeneralizations because, for example, if you see content online and you compare yourself with more superior others, that's linked to poor mental health, but you can also feel inspired by the content of other people, and that's something that's associated with better mental health.
You have another very quick remark.
I have a question actually. Is the poor mental health, like social media, we're just like scrolling through, and this is like, how to say, related to poor mental health. Is it the reason, or is it an amplifier?
So that's indeed a big issue. So in research, we are always looking at temporal precedents. So it means that we want to see whether, for example, the health outcome came after the social media use. And that's something that's really difficult. Most studies in research are cross-sectional. So we love doing longitudinal studies. And today we also tend to focus on EMA studies, which are ecological momentary assessments. So this means that we ask people to install an app on their smartphone, and the app gives several notifications a day, and then they fill in a short questionnaire about how they feel and about how they perceived their social media use. And that's something that's a handy tool to confirm this temporal precedence. So it's really something difficult, but we bear it in mind.
Very much. I like to have help with moderation, no problem. Which brings me to actually the well-being as a concept. Ben already said that it's not a uniform thing. It looks different at 10, 14, 17. It can differ by gender, socioeconomic background. So, Karen, does it make sense to think about youth as a monolithic category?
No.
Okay.
No, well-being is indeed something that may differ from person to person, but similar to what I said before, the effects of factors such as age or gender do not systematically point in the same direction. So even in my own studies, I've sometimes found age and gender effects, and in other studies, I've not. So again, it's not a homogeneous picture. But that does not mean that the effects of social media are the same for all young people. We have come to realize that the effects are quite heterogeneous. Even if you look at one specific person, we see that the effects of social media use might be different when you compare moment A to moment B. So it's really heterogeneous, and therefore the central question in the field is no longer are social media harmful or not, but who benefits from what. So the debate has already changed a bit. And one way I approach this question in my research is by looking at individual characteristics like introversion, because people tend to react in a similar way across situations when you look at such characteristics. For example, somebody who is introverted in a school environment might also be introverted in the youth movement. So that's why it's a meaningful approach. And in my research, I found that those individuals tend to experience a lot of social support online, but they also report,
Okay, which actually brings me to my next question, which is then how important is it to focus intervention in the real world rather than only looking at the virtual one?
Yeah, I think it's really important to take a pragmatic approach. So research has shown that offline interventions or online interventions with an offline component tend to produce better results than online interventions alone. But we know that the online world is really important for young people. So that's why I think that it allows us to reach certain people who would otherwise not seek help. So it might be a tool to reach those young people.
Okay, and now I have a very difficult question because I'm going to ask you to look in the crystal ball. Assume social media access is restricted for under 16 today. What would you predict for tomorrow, considering both the gains and the unintended consequences that such a ban could have?
Yeah, I think initially such a restriction would cause people who no longer have access to a social media account to experience reduced well-being, simply because their need for autonomy, so the desire to stand on your own and to make your own decision would be impacted. And this would inevitably result in resistance. So I expect young people to try to bypass the system in order to continue to access their social media accounts. I also expect them to search for alternatives. Because the digital adolescence, in which individuals mainly use social media for social purposes. So, for example, chatting with other people already starts at the end of primary school. And of course, you want to know something about the mental health effects. I think that young people would potentially be less exposed to potentially harmful content. For example, videos depicting self-harm. So that's the positive aspect. But I expect them also to miss out on the potentially beneficial effects of social media. For me, the most important consequence would be a loss of social capital, or at least a reduction of social capital, because some people really feel excluded, whether it be because of learning disorders, sexual orientation, or social anxiety, and those people often find support online. That's
it's quite a contrasted picture. Thank you. And my very last question, and you're very lucky because we've got Ben on the panel representing the platforms. If you had the ear of a few social media operators, what would you ask them to do?
Mm-hmm. I can think of many possible changes, but two suggestions immediately come to my mind. First, I think it's important to critically reflect on the role of algorithms. I already talked about the fact that people differ from one another, and that the most important question in this field today is who benefits from what. But that also means that we are interested in what's harmful for whom. So yeah, we cannot force people to engage in or to refrain from certain online behaviors, but we can create an environment that nudges people in the most healthy direction. So that's why I'm thinking of algorithms. And I already told you that some people are inclined to compare themselves with others. And so, I think that if we would stop using strongly personalized algorithms, we would reduce the extent to which individuals are exposed to the continuous stream of sometimes idealized and more and more extreme content.
Okay. Does the ear want to respond?
Yes, of course. Very, very happy to answer. I think the discussion on algorithms and the question whether or not this is addictive, this discussion is being taken out individually, platform by platform, via the DSA. I know this is a very, non-sexy answer, but I think it's good that we have this framework. In place. By the way, now with the review of the AVMSD directive, we will also see a focus on the protection of minors. And we see on the horizon the Digital Fairness Act, which will probably also include, if not even the issue of an age gap. But I would like to bring Australia, if I may.
Go ahead.
I would like to build a bridge.
You want to build a bridge? Okay, let's build a bridge.
When we look at Australia, there's I read a recent study carried out amongst others by MIT and by Max Planck Institute. And it was said that 27% of the younger people, they actually obey to the law, which sounds like a very low number, but the authors of the study say it's actually pretty high. The more important question is who actually stays on the platforms. And there the headline was, the cool people, they stay on the platform. So the amount of people obeying to the law might actually get, again, lower depending on the peer group. And that actually leads me back to the question, where should this discussion actually take place? And I think it should take place in peer groups. And that brings back schools and young people. For example, when you have a discussion, you can have a discussion in school, for example, in the different classes about whether or not you're using social media or not. And that is the place, I think, where you should actually...
So what is your question to Carly?
No, I was just like bringing back the Australian situation a bit. Right. So that was the thing.
No, thank you very much, Ben, for trying to bridge between Europe and Australia, because I was actually going to go back to Carly and try to get her reaction, possibly to Ben's comments, and maybe to try to see and tell us what is the biggest misconception in the debate that you would like to correct, maybe.
Yeah, really good question. I think Ben's point's an interesting one, and I think what you would see happening in Australia is, it may be a conversation that needs to happen in peer groups. I think it's certainly a conversation that has to happen amongst parents, and I say this as a parent, but to very young children who haven't yet reached this age. But I think what we're seeing here in kind of cultural conversation is parents need to kind of hold the line together in terms of permitting a friendship group to kind of use these tools, because there is that network effect in the real world of if all your friends come to school and they're talking about what they talked about on Snap last night, and you want to be involved. So the parents kind of are forming an important line there. But I think what's interesting about the Australian experience for its failures and potentially limitations is it's creating reinforcement for parents. It's serving like quite an interesting social role that parents wanted, which was something to lean on when they say no to their children. And I think that we can have a very philosophical discussion about whether that's the right role that law should play, and is regulation there to change society in that way. But I just observe, I think that's one of the interesting things that's happening in Australia. I wanted to say, I'm sorry, Karen, I couldn't hear much what you were saying because your microphone wasn't working well, but I did want to observe, just in terms of consultation with children, I can't speak to what consultation was done on the social media ban. I think it was not, it didn't squarely centre children. And certainly it was highly driven by campaigns, by parent campaigns, at least in the first instance, and highly informed also by academic research, including Jonathan Haidt's book. It was actually quite a seminal influence over the Australian policy process. But in terms of what we're doing as the Data Protection Authority on our Children's Online Privacy Code, we've been doing really, really extensive consultation of children. We've just begun a second round of consultation. In the first round, we received written submissions from around 300 children and their parents. This consultation, we've developed syllabuses for schools to use to engage children in what do you want to see in terms of online privacy protection. And we've done that for different age groups, so children aged 8 to 12, children aged 13 to 16, and younger people, as well as parents. And so we've been trying really hard, to your point about engaging children at the right point in the process, to have them feed in right from the very outset about what do you want, what kind of online space do you want. And the results have been fascinating, not only because it completely debunks the myth that children don't understand privacy and that they don't embrace privacy in really interesting ways, like they know full well when their location is being shared on Snap Maps, and they know also how to turn on ghost mode, and they use those tools like quite fluently to protect their privacy in different situations. But also to observe how children and children's expectations around privacy differ from their parents as well, and at sometimes come into conflict too. So I think we're trying really hard in that work that we are leading to make sure that children's voices are right at the heart of what we're seeing. And in terms of kind of myths that could be debunked, I suppose we are seeing that we had fears that the introduction of age assurance requirements would materially undermine privacy protections for all Australians. We haven't yet seen that fear come to realisation. We have seen, in fact, a more tailored approach to age assurance be rolled out in the context of the ban. In particular, we've seen age estimation apps and tools be used quite effectively and in quite data minimising ways by the platforms, which does give us hope that technology provides some of the privacy preserving solutions that might be needed in this space.
Thank you very much for this last consideration, which is very important also in the EU, as we are working on a blueprint, not on an app. I'd like to give my audience the possibility to ask questions. Do we have any questions? And do we have any mic for the questions?
Thank you. Is it working? Can you hear me? Awesome. I think my question relies more in the focus of when you mentioned, for example, unintended consequences. And my question, are those intended consequences or not? Because looking, for example, at a panel, it's still a white dominant panel. And we're talking about education, for example, as a tool, or we're talking about elections, but who has access to those spaces to elect themselves? Or who has access to the spaces to be in the front line in these positions to talk about these things? So I think they're really intended consequences, because it's still the dominant group who's talking about these conversations. But for example, I'm youth, I'm a migrant, I'm racialized, but I'm nowhere around youth councils of countries, because simply those spaces are not open for people like us. There is no trust between the European youth and the other youth, because that division still exists in those movements as well. So how is this reflecting on policies like this, age verification? For example, from your end, it might be like, oh, this is good as it is, but there is some gaps, and that's okay. But for us, it's terrible. So how do you think this is unintended when we think this is very systemically built this way, if that makes sense? I think that's from one end. And another end is, I'm really curious of like, why are we always referring to Australia or to the US when we can build our own approach to this. The Australian history is different than the European one when it comes to migration, when it comes to the racialized folks in here. In Australia, there is a recognition of the indigenous folks. In the US, talks about racism are different, but when we come to Europe, these things are in denial. So how are we comparing these things when also socially we're not the same?
Thank you very much for these questions. No, definitely we are not the same, but looking at what others are doing sometimes also can enrich our perspective on things. Who wants to take the question?
So if I could just jump in very quickly, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to say, I think your point is right that it sometimes can ring very false to talk about unintended consequences. The result that a system produces is the intended result that the system has, clearly. And I think the point around inclusion is a really essential one. In Australia, as you rightly point out, we have a particular history around Indigenous groups, and Indigenous children are some of the most vulnerable and marginalised in our society, the most vulnerable and marginalised in our society. And engaging them, it can require overcoming a lot of barriers, cultural, geographic, amongst others. And we've had to work quite hard to do that, but you do have to be very intentional about it. The other point I wanted to make in terms of the virtues of comparing the Australian experience and using it as a blueprint or an inspiration for other jurisdictions, certainly we've had a lot of interest, and I've been invited to talk a lot about what's happened in Australia. I would observe, having lived in Europe myself for 16 years and then relocated back to Australia only recently, the Australian culture is very different, including in terms of a preference towards safety and regulations, in a way that I don't think transports in necessarily to other countries. And of course, every country in Europe will be different. But I would say I've noticed a much higher tolerance for these kinds of regulatory schemes in Australia than I might have in other European countries I've lived in.
The French are also quite risk averse, I would say, and tend to also rely on the regulation. But yeah, no, definitely. I was not trying to say that because we are watching what others are doing, then necessarily we need to import or export the model. But this is a space that is moving very fast. So looking at, trying to understand some of these effects in other places might be useful insight. Ben?
Yeah, but also I think it was a very valuable point to say that we should look at this from a diverse angle, not only like in terms of different countries, but in terms of diverse groups. I can only say, for example, myself, I'm gay. I was grew up in a very rural area in Germany, and I was during school I was still probably not conscious that I was gay, but there were gay people, like not that many, openly gay in school, and they were bullied. And I very often think about this when we now talk about restriction to social media, because I think when you're actively looking for help or for peer groups on social media, so this could be of tremendous value, especially when you don't have them around you. And that should be taken into consideration when we think about social media ban for children.
Karen, do you want to say anything?
No, not really. Race and things like that are not always taken into account in research studies. Of course, we include them in our demographic questionnaires, but it's not something that's always controlled for, simply because it's frequently quite hard to get participants, and then the representation is not
it's also a problem for the research. Yeah, definitely. But thank you very much for the questions. Other questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is on whoever wants to reply on the relationship of accuracy in the methodology of age assurance and the consequences that this has at social level among youngsters. I mean, if I think of data protection, I think that the less you have, unique identifiers in order to give age verification, from the privacy point of view, in theory, the better it is, because of course you miss profile, you would not have profiling and tracking, these kind of things, even though we know that there are debates on methodologies and cryptology that can help on that. Level of maturity maybe is debated and so forth and so on. Nevertheless, the problem is where you have inaccuracy and possibility of circumventing, let's say, these things, I think of devastating social consequences for youngsters. Can you imagine a society where you have the group of smart people that have circumvented all that and can still have all their life, you know, in the social networks, and those who are completely excluded because they have been enforced, you know, strongly by parents and by, you know, and they have a completely different life. Think of how social networks influence, you know, children and the young youth, let's say, at this stage. So I think that this is, what's your point of view on this? I see it devastating as a consequence.
I don't know if the question was to me or if you were...
Whoever wants to reply, even the commissioner, but also you as a representative of youth. And
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think you're right in terms of if we implement an age-based restriction, obviously you're going to have some young people better equipped to go around these restrictions, and so you're going to have some young people or some young people or children excluded from social media, and some who are going to find ways around these restrictions. So that's why we are more about education rather than age-based restriction. And I think when we talk with young people, that's also what they tell us, is that social media is an important part of their daily life in terms of building a community, sharing information, etc. And obviously, we do not want to see inequality, being created through this social media ban.
Carly, do you want to add anything?
I suppose that just observe two things. One is that from our perspective, there should be multiple kind of appeal processes so that children can contest any adverse decision or incorrect decision, and that's part of the obligations. But you know, the other complexity here, I don't have an answer, just to observe another complexity is it is not in the interests of the regulated platforms to comply with the law, because it involves excluding people from their platforms. And so, which is not to say that they're not complying, but just to say that there's a complicated mix of ensuring there's a cost to non-compliance that will come in time with enforcement activities that the e-Safety Commissioner and our Commission will take under the Act. And until there is enforcement of those obligations, I suspect we'll continue to see a wide variety of compliance and children's experiences differing pretty dramatically.
More questions? Yes.
Yes, thanks. Sarah Brandstetter from MLEX. I'm a journalist here in Brussels. And this is a question for the Commissioner. I was wondering if you've been receiving privacy complaints relating to the social media ban. And also another one, if you have any thoughts to share on the EU's age verification app that has been presented, and if there are similar plans to present something like that in Australia as well. Thanks.
Should I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I have no views on the EU's app, and I saw some smiles on the panel. I don't know if others wanted to speak about their views on that. I don't imagine that such an approach would be taken in Australia. The government has been keen to rely on or not technically prescribe the approach towards age assurance, but rather to prescribe the outcome, which is that children should be restricted from accessing platforms, and to use this reasonable steps obligation, which is very popular in Australian law, because it doesn't prescribe technical requirements. It just says you have to achieve this outcome in a reasonable and proportionate manner. In terms of whether we've had privacy complaints, we were bracing ourselves for a great many, and we've received very, very few. And I think that's quite interesting. Part of that, I think, turns on the fact it may turn on a range of different things. One, perhaps children aren't being properly restricted from the platforms, and that some of the research shows that, as I think Ben said, 30% or so of children are meeting those restrictions, and it's not fully implemented across society yet. The second is that the forms of age assurance are perhaps less visible to people than we expected them to be. So we anticipated that perhaps every social media platform would have, a blocker on day one of the obligation, which says you can't use this platform anymore unless you age verify, even if you're like myself in my 40s, that I would still encounter that. That's not what happened. And it's possible that they're doing some invisible forms of age assurance, which means that people aren't really notified that that is happening in the background. And so they're not kind of triggered to make a privacy complaint about it. To the extent we have received privacy complaints, they've been around the review processes and appeal processes where people are asked to provide copies of identity documents and other ways in order to contest an adverse age outcome. But it has been very few privacy complaints to date.
Thank you, Carly. More questions?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you for the very interesting panel. My name is Esther Forsten from the KU Leuven. I'm a legal researcher, so a bit more of a legal question for you. So we were talking about the social media ban or delay. And we're talking about it like it's quite of an optional thing, like debating whether we should do it or not. But also in the light of human rights protection, the ECHR has a long-standing case law on positive obligations of states. So states not only have the negative obligation to protect fundamental rights, but also a positive obligation. So for example, freedom of speech, they need to actively take measures to protect people's freedom of speech. So I was wondering if you could see the intervention of the state right now as kind of an obligation even for the states, that it would be quite negligent to not intervene.
That it would be negligent to?
To not intervene. To not take measures like a social media delay, or could of course be other measures, of course, to do nothing or to keep the status quo would maybe be also negligent on the part of the legislator.
And you're asking the question?
Whoever wants to respond.
It's a very difficult balancing of different types of fundamental rights. I would start with that. But is there anyone on the panel that would...
I didn't get quite the question, I have to say. So balancing the freedom of speech against what?
So that it's an obligation for the states to protect minors against information online that is harmful for them. So also actively protect their freedom of speech and their right to privacy. There's also case law on the fact that the ECHR says that states need to protect the physical and moral integrity of minors. So this could be seen as an active obligation on the part of the states to intervene.
Yeah, the question is, the devil is in the details again. So when you intervene, therefore you are applying measures and trying to get results that might impact not only the minors, but also all the adults around that. So it's trying to find the right balance to do that. And I think the answer is not that obvious. This is why we're trying to develop the privacy preserving technology that Carly spoke about. And the answer is not that obvious, given the fact that we don't have like one monolithic category either. We've got different needs for different types of ranges. So yeah, I think the answer to your question is not that obvious, given the complexity of the rights, the stakeholders, and the details of the implementation. Yeah, that would be where I would start, but I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. Carly, do you have any thought on fundamental rights, maybe? Any other... wait, we are on... Is there any one last question very quickly said, to which a very quick answer will be given, and then we can break.
Hello, my name is Beatrice. I'm a PhD student. And I'm curious because there is much, conversation revolving around banning or restricting children, as we know. And although I do not think a ban is the solution, I do understand where you're coming from. However, I feel like there is a missing point in the conversation, which I hardly ever hear when talking about bans, which is children being portrayed or featured online by their parents. So in this, like restricting kind of framework, where we're talking about, taking children out of the conversation as users, what about children as content creators or part of, family run accounts?
So I can point you to a second panel early afternoon to which will deal with that question. I think my panelists need to go. But thank you so much. Unless anyone wants to say 3 words from the panel to answer that question, which will be difficult, I think I need to close. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Val.
Yeah.